Yeah, but your question's dumb.
Oh, fuck off. What the fuck, man?
Hello, and welcome to Expected Own Goals. I don't remember my dreams too much. I hardly ever have gotten ideas from nighttime dreams, but I love daydreaming and dream logic and the way dreams go edition. I am your host, Eric Morgan.
I'm Evan Davis. You know, I thought that there was bigger news that had occurred over the last week, and there is big news. We will talk about it, but it's been a little bit quiet in terms of major headline brain-breaking news in the NWSL. But we soldier on. There are things to discuss. We're going to focus on a couple of teams whose off-seasons may be kind of crystallizing and might not alter too much more over the next couple of months.
I think that there are a lot of moves that, as the dust settles on them, have had knock-on effects that are interesting and are sort of slowly changing my priors as I think about what the upcoming season looks like and making me wonder about the relative health and logic of some of these teams. Let's start off by talking the most seismic shift that has occurred inside a roster for me is still probably what's happened at North Carolina.
Yeah, and we talked about Jaedyn Shaw being traded. We now have the financials. I think they got announced like the day that episode went up, but we now have the financials. San Diego is going to receive $300,000 in allocation money, $150,000 in intra-league transfer funds, and an international roster slot for 2025 and in 2026, respectively. And if North Carolina manages to acquire more allocation money this year, they are required to send $75,000 in allocation money to San Diego, and potentially all the intra-league transfer funds would be coming back to North Carolina, which is a very financially convoluted deal. One I don't think we've really seen quite in this form before. But we said last week that this should be probably the largest intra-league transfer in the league's history. Does it get there for you, given all of these little switchbacks and fine print details?
It's giving me the vibe of the scene in the gangster movie when the North Carolina mob boss being held over the side by San Diego, being told, you can't pay it all today, but you have X amount of time to pay back the rest of this big thing. Mm-hmm. So I can't decide whether I think North Carolina went too far over a barrel for this one to grab Jaedyn Shaw, or whether they are outright the winners of this. This is a trade we won't really be able to assess as winners and losers for at least a year. Yeah. Because we have to see what these things become. Initially, I felt this was a win for North Carolina. And the more I sort of see what the financials look like here, this feels like it could end up being a win for San Diego, or at least getting a king's ransom back in return.
What it sort of feels like is that the $150K of intra-league transfer funds is essentially like collateral.
Yes, exactly.
And what San Diego really wants is more allocation money, which is actually interesting and may portend future trades and how they could get worked out, especially now that you require players' consent to get trades done. That allocation money is worth more to teams than intra-league transfer funds, which makes sense because you can use allocation money for a lot of different things. Salary cap buy down, pay it for international transfer fees, all kinds of things. And you only have it for another couple of years. So the more you can get, the more things you can do in the next couple of seasons. So it is interesting that they have decided that the exchange rate essentially is 2-to-1, that allocation money is worth probably about twice as much as intra-league transfer funds. Shaw wanted to move. They needed to find a trade partner. North Carolina was interested. North Carolina was like, we cannot pay you $375K straight transfer allocation cash. What if we kicked in $150K in transfer funds now? And if we can get more allocation money, we'll send that to you, and then you just send this other stuff back. It's this very interesting negotiation. It's like, everybody needs this to happen. How can we find marginal ways to make it financially sensible for everybody involved? Because Shaw's just that kind of player. She's not going to play in San Diego this year. She is agitating for a trade. There's just no way that you had to get a deal done.
Mm-hmm.
San Diego knew that they could not get lowballed, knowing they had lost the leverage of the player wanting to move. So, like, this is sort of a very interesting best case scenario, I think.
I think so, too. It's a smaller sticker than the Yasmeen Ryan to Houston deal in terms of just the allocation money.
Yeah.
But I think it has...
roster slots count for something. They're international roster spots.
Yeah, I think ultimately it is a bigger deal.
Yeah.
I think what it shakes out to be will be a bigger cash windfall in return for San Diego than Ryan to Houston will be for Gotham. But we say all of this, and we'll return to San Diego in a second, knowing that Jaedyn Shaw now has the burden of essentially replacing Caroline.
ESPN Brazil late last week broke the story that Caroline was being transferred to Manchester City. Nothing official has been announced yet, but the reporting seems pretty solid on this. The Shaw move initially, that story broke days before the Caroline news broke, seemed to indicate, given North Carolina's other financial situation, they were not going to be able to carry both players. So, like, it probably meant that Caroline was out the door. But yeah, no, Shaw is now the face of the North Carolina Courage.
She and Ashley Sanchez, for sure. I have felt Caroline was gone kind of from the end of the season. I think this is just the brave new world in which we live. What we are seeing both in the Ryan and Shaw deals and now with Caroline departing and possibly with Girma departing is we are in a place where women's soccer is going through a transition of club power to player power. Generally speaking, I think that's healthy. Caroline going to Man City, I think, is a fine move for Caroline, but this, I think, hurts North Carolina pretty significantly. I don't think Jaedyn Shaw fills that hole next year. Maybe on down the line.
We talked about it last week that they're not a one-to-one replacement, and if you try to move Shaw onto the wing, that's not where she's most comfortable. If you try to play a double 10 with Ashley Sanchez, that's going to leave space for losing the ball in midfield, which Sean Nahas is not going to be comfortable with, and they kind of don't have the defensive cover to make that work either. You try and playing her as a false nine, that's going to require more back-to-goal play from Shaw, which is not necessarily her strongest suit. So there just isn't a comfortable solve here. They have 27 players under active contract at the moment. So if North Carolina is going to try and like add a piece to solve those issues, they're going to have to get rid of 2 players in order to do that. I mean, they already are going to have to get rid of 1 player to get under 26. This might just be what the Courage are at the moment.
Yeah.
And that is going to be very tricky despite Shaw's massive, massive gifts. We'll talk about the Caroline transfer if it becomes official. We'll talk about her place in Manchester City. We'll talk about that on Patreon. We're going to do a big European roundup on the first couple of weeks since the seasons have come back. Let's talk about San Diego. The big news being that Naomi Girma appears to be headed either to Chelsea or Lyon based on reporting that they are the 2 teams sort of in the running to sign her on a transfer deal. Lyon is reported to have offered a $1 million transfer fee. We don't know how much Chelsea offered. There is reporting that suggests that Chelsea is still the front runner, but we don't know anything more than that. Ever since these rumors broke many weeks ago, hard to imagine that Girma was going to stay. That also explains why maybe the Wave just made their most recent signing, which is 17-year-old Trinity Armstrong, a center back out of UNC. I think I have to write about this and just have the headline be San Diego. What are they up to here?
Well, I'll say the following. If you are going to attempt to re-sign Naomi Girma to a large amount of money, having $300,000 in allocation money come back your direction does not hurt you, nor does that additional $75K. I think if the money is right and I'm San Diego, I'm probably good with making this move. As opposed to being hamstrung because you signed a central defender. And that's not to say that central defenders aren't important. I just think when you have the cap that you have in this league, Naomi Girma is easier to replace than other players.
Let's say for the sake of argument that it will be $1 million and you just got $1.3 million in allocation funds from moving Shaw and Girma on. That extra international roster spot all of a sudden becomes very interesting because they've got 6 internationals roster spots taken, but with this additional one, that means they've got 2 to play with. And $1.3 million in allocation money that you could use on 2 international transfers could completely reshape the complexion of the Wave. They got space to move. If Girma moves on, they'll still have 7 roster spots to fill. and all of a sudden have a nice little chunk of change to do it. Because at the moment, the average age of this roster, if you just go by season age, is going to be about 24 and a half. And if you try to project a starting 11, it is not necessarily a playoff contending 11,
No.
irrespective of Delphine Cascarino and Kaylin Sheridan and Maria Sanchez being there.
No, it's not. And still no midfield to speak of, which I find amusing. But if you're going to build a midfield, again, $1.3 million is not the worst amount of money to have just sitting around to fill a couple of midfield spots. San Diego's interesting because they came into the league kind of built to win now. And now that has not come to pass, I mean, they grabbed a shield. If the shield were prized more, as it probably should be.
And grabbed a shield on the lowest points per game total any shield winner has ever won that prize.
And we're possibly lucky to grab that shield and like yada, yada, yada. But if you're going to blow up your team, they're doing some pretty interesting stuff to come back and build something that might be more sustainable, particularly over the years in which the cap continues to raise consistently. It seems to me that their plan right now is to figure out what they have with a whole host of young players, hope some of them hit, and have their ability to club control those players should they become big hits for long periods of time.
Yeah.
So I don't hate that.
And you mentioned not a midfield to speak of. I think Gia Corley could potentially be something quite interesting. She's had a very nice season as a sort of number 8, number 10 hybrid at Hoffenheim and is only 23. If she hits, that could solve some midfield problems. And Armstrong doesn't turn 18 until the end of July of 2025. She's a one-and-done freshman at a UNC as a center back. For those of you who are not Patreon subscribers, we did a big episode on a lot of college players in the Futures Camp last week, where we looked at Y-Scout data and isolated games that those players had played against ranked teams at the end of the 2024 college season and U20 World Cup stats if that applied. Armstrong obviously was not part of the U20 setup, but she played for UNC. They won a national championship, FYI, and she ended up getting a lot of minutes against really good teams. She got almost 1,000 minutes against really good teams. She was their starting center back at 17. She was pretty good. A 79% defensive dual win rate, like a 68% forward pass percentage, almost 15 forward passes completed per 96 as a center back. That's good. 6 interceptions per 96 as a center back. That's good.
Yeah, it's a question of how she handles the jump.
Yeah.
It's not a question of whether she's talented. It's a question of like whether at 17, 18, she is ready to handle a pretty serious jump in opposition quality.
Our friend Chris Henderson, who is one of the foremost public-facing data-centric scouts for the college game, has said of Armstrong that she had absolutely nothing left to prove in college and needed to go pro. Does that mean she rides the bench and gets a few hundred injury-driven minutes as a replacement for San Diego? Does she just drop into the 11 immediately because she's just that talented? We don't know yet. We will not have those answers for another couple of months, but this is a very promising player at an age where, much like Claire Hutton last year, is playing well against strong opposition that was available to her at a position where you just don't do that at that age. The ceiling for me, and again, massive asterisks, massive brackets, massive caveats on variance here. There is a lot of upside, I think, for this player.
I certainly think the numbers look good. They are college numbers. We'll temper that expectation the right way. What I like about this is if you keep Girma, you have a perfect understudy that you've just signed.
That's right.
And if you don't keep Girma, you have someone that you can build to step up and play that part.
And by the way, if Girma goes, they only have 2 dedicated center backs on the roster, Kennedy Wesley and Trinity Armstrong. You can move Kristen McNabb inside potentially. Like, you could play around with some of your pieces if you don't think Armstrong is ready. But for the moment, if Girma is gone, this is your dedicated center back depth here. Armstrong is one of those 2 people.
All right, Evan, I want to ask you, do you think Girma is gone?
I do. I do think she's gone. I think that it is going to be very difficult, even with this new $300K, potentially $375K that they have in their transfer kitty, to convince her to stay and sign an extension. Because that's all you can do right now. The only option you really have in your locker, if you are Camille Ashton, is to offer her an extension for a very, very large pay bump, because she's not the best paid player, because she took a very team-friendly extension, and center backs tend to be valued less in the marketplace than attacking players are. She's got 2 years left on her deal, so you're going to have to offer her minimum a 2-year extension, probably 3, and back up the money truck, which you might not have, in order to say don't go to Chelsea or Lyon. Whatever arguments you could make about staying in San Diego aren't going to be good enough if you can't match the money. People who want to be like, oh, but her sponsorship dollars, oh, but she's not going to get competitive enough games. Like, those aren't good enough reasons to reject whatever Chelsea and Lyon can offer her. And also, what Chelsea and Lyon can offer her on a competitive level is not nothing. You got to go up against, in training every single day, against Lyon's strikers or against Chelsea's attackers. You're going to learn something about yourself. I know it's going to suck to have to play West Ham and Brighton and all these bad teams over and over again. I get that, but she's not an idiot. She's going to know how to keep pushing herself and getting herself better. Like, she is not going to lose developmental time by going to Europe, especially not so much developmental time that it wouldn't be worth it for the money that she's going to get paid. We have to say this all the time. Women's soccer players don't get fuck you money across the course of their careers. If someone's offering you a bigger paycheck than somebody else, you're almost obligated to take it, because you're not going to be able to retire, and your great-grandchildren aren't going to be able to retire on the money that you make right now in your career. You have to maximize your earning potential. You have to do it if it's available to you.
I would not like to see her at Lyon, because I think the D1 Arkema is a significantly diminished competitive environment. Chelsea, I think that's probably an interesting place for her to end up. If I were in Naomi Girma's shoes and the money was the same from those two clubs, I'd go to Chelsea. I trust that she will take the best choice for herself, but I would have reservations about playing in France in a way I would not have reservations about playing in England.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. Lindsay Horan has been there for a while. She might have a perspective on it that is attractive to Girma. We don't know.
In the grand scheme of things, these are largely champagne problems, because Naomi Girma is already very good, and she will continue to be very good, and it won't make a big difference about where she ends up as to whether she remains good.
And she makes Chelsea and Lyon better.
She's a day one starter for both of those teams, almost certainly. She's a day one starter for any club you'd put her in the world right now, I think. San Diego has a Saved by the Bell thing going on right now, and the youth movement is interesting. I think given the set of circumstances San Diego find themselves in, I think that they are taking an interesting, good approach to this problem, even if I am uncertain about the caliber of each of their new signings. Yeah. If you're going to blow it up with youth. Don't do what Seattle's sort of done, where you blow it up and bring in 30-year-olds.
Speaking of interesting projects, we now get a chance to talk about the news that Angel City has hired a GM, officially a sporting director, none other than Mark Parsons, old friend of the NWSL for his time at Washington Spirit and at the Portland Thorns as their head coach. Most recently, head coach of the Washington Spirit for the 2023 season, fired at the end of that season after they were a point off of making the playoffs.
And quite unfortunate to be in that position.
They were pretty unlucky, Washington, in that season. One of the, if not the most unlucky teams, if you look at the split between their expected points and the actual points that they earned. We said on Patreon, this feels like a shockingly sensible pickup by Angel City to sign Mark Parsons. Now that you've had a few days to sit with it, what do you make of this?
We're taking a person who has proven themselves to be a good coach and a well-respected coach, as best as I can tell from all the players that have played for Parsons.
Within the game, he has a very strong reputation. In America, which we'll talk about the other part later. But yes, in the NWSL, he has a very strong reputation, both with players, coaching staffs, and executives alike.
And then you assign them to a new role whose responsibilities seem relatively nebulous. I have a general idea of what he's going to be doing, but I sort of don't understand, especially with a coaching vacancy, why Mark Parsons isn't just your coach, which would have been a great hire. And what's the plan from here for Angel City? And then Angel City goes and does the thing that they do, and they make good choices. on a much grander scale what they did with Julie Dufour, which is you've signed a really good player at a position you don't have need. You've signed a really good mind for this game, and then you've gone and paid Christen Press more money to come back and take up starter minutes. So it's like they just blew off a toe in my mind as far as why did you shoot yourself in the foot after making the first really good decision you've made?
Yeah.
Granted, I know Press is on a 1-year deal, and who knows how favorable that is. And you know what? A full season of a healthy Christen Press could be really great. I just wouldn't bet on it.
Like you said, we don't know the money that's involved in re-signing Press for a year. Can't imagine her average annual value matches the initial contract and extensions she signed with Angel City. So it's hard to know how much of a cap hit they're taking, bringing her back. Given the proximity of the Parsons announcement and the Press announcement, I don't think Parsons was really involved in those negotiations. It should be stated clearly on that level. Parsons, you mentioned why wouldn't he just be the head coach? I don't know if Parsons was looking for a head coaching job. He took basically a full year away from the game, did some punditry work in England, was always posting on social media that he was at the latest WSL game. Like, he was definitely keeping his presence active, both in public and probably behind the scenes within the industry. But I don't know if he was necessarily looking for a head coaching gig. He likes player development, and he was involved in player acquisition when he was with the Thorns because Gavin Wilkinson was the president of soccer ops for the Thorns at the time. And I don't get the sense that Wilkinson really had his full attention thrown toward the Thorns as opposed to his work with the Timbers. So I think a lot of that came down to Parsons finding players, advocating for players, and asking Wilson to go get those deals done. And a lot of really great players came to Portland under Parsons' watch.
Mm-hmm.
And if that is very much down to him, he could bring that same level of acumen to Angel City. We don't know if that's going to happen. Again, he's never been a formal sporting director / GM before. And then, of course, the biggest thing, which I think this is the real shoot your toe off thing about this, is that he's reporting directly to Julie Ehrman.
And again, it's like you get hired and are immediately saddled with a player that you yourself might not have re-signed. And you're like, by the way, we did this other thing too, which will hamstring you almost certainly for whatever vision you have. And also you're reporting to snake oil narcissist merchant. So, game on, Mark.
We don't really know what the role that Ehrman is going to occupy now. Is she going to be as involved or try to make herself as involved in soccer operations in the way that she did before with Angela Hucles Mangano and Enya Luco before that? Will she take more of a step back and really focus on business ops? Which I'm not saying she'd be very good at that either, but couldn't be any worse. We don't really know. But what we do know is that in the press release announcing this is that it's Ehrman who gives the quotes about Parsons. It's not Willow Bay. So at least from what we can see in the public side of things, it does seem like he will be Ehrman's direct report. And again, how much meddling will she do? How will Pawnee will she get? It's an unanswered question.
That's a great way of putting it, because I suppose if Julie Ehrman has learned from the mismanagement that has defined Angel City's on the field and off the field performance for the run of the team, if she has learned from some of this and that Parsons is step one in getting the right people in positions to help them succeed, that's great. I don't think that's the likeliest outcome based on what we've seen out of Angel City so far. And you can hire good people, but good people will struggle in dysfunctional environments.
The other positive spin might be, and again, we can't know this, might be that Willow Bay is going to muzzle her and just tell her, stay in your goddamn lane. We don't know. The last hire that they made for chief revenue officer seems to be more of a Julie Ehrman aligned individual. So that might be wishful thinking and a pipe dream. But also, I think maybe they are willing to accept punting on 2025. They still have a few roster spots to fill, but other than Julie Dufour, they're not really making a big splash. They might not have the money to do it either. Parsons very clearly stated in some press availability last week that they're not rushing to hire a head coach. They're going to stick with Ellery Earnshaw as interim head coach for as long as they deem it necessary until the right person becomes available for them to hire. And I interpret that to mean that Parsons is thinking strategically and long-term in a way that might be more beneficial to the team on the field than otherwise. And it also tells me that you don't necessarily believe that you've got the team to make the playoffs this year if you just decided that, like, we'll ride with our interim as long as we need to. They are willing to just say 2025 is a write-off and we're more interested in how to make this a more sustainably successful team, then that could be a very functional structure to work with in the front office. But that's based on public statements to the press that are always going to be through a bit of rose-colored glass, and we haven't seen the evidence of it occurring yet, whereas we have a history of evidence of what this team is like when Julie Uhrman's involved. So I think there are two paths that Angel City could go down here, and I hope they take one and not the other, but we'll see.
In a series of moves, this is a good one. The question, I think, for Parsons is, can I overcome some of the other moves that have maybe not been good ones? Can I exist in an environment where, like, I have enough rope to survive a year of missing the playoffs?
And that's part of the propaganda of saying, like, we want to get things right this time, no matter how long it takes. You know, try to soften the blow of potentially facing a fourth straight losing season. And listen, like, he's going to need the time to remake this roster into something that will work. There are a lot of expensive, long contracts on the books at the moment. He's got his hands tied a little bit, and we know that their cap space is tight, if not completely maxed out. So it's all a matter of how much Willow Bay and Julie Uhrman are willing to ride it. As, you know, whatever fan pressure might come, like, it's really about what Willow Bay and Uhrman, if she's got power, thinks about what he's done and what he is able to do in the future. For us, that means the right decision would be to keep him if they end up in a losing season at the end of the year. But it really matters what Willow Bay and Julie Uhrman, if she's empowered in this regard, think about another losing season and to what extent he is responsible for it. It's probably wise to take a page out of Orlando's book here.
Yeah,
you know,
that's right.
And just let the process take hold and really empower Parsons to run things.
Julie Uhrman, if you're listening, and I doubt you are, I highly recommend you go back and listen to our interview with Haley Carter and just do what she and Hines did and just get out of the way of smart people. And you've done a good job in hiring Mark Parsons. He is a good hire. And now just get out of the way.
If people don't like him because of missing the playoffs in Washington in 2023 or how things went in the Netherlands in 2022, like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, Washington was so unlucky in 2023 and they still almost made the playoffs. The Netherlands was sort of going to be a failure before it had even started because he was trying to juggle both jobs for a while and didn't have a lot of time with the players. That was just always going to be a really, really tough ask for that to be successful. A lot of the decisions around trading players were not his. They were Mark Krikorian's or they were Gavin Wilkinson's. As much power as he had in, like, identifying players and advocating players, like, Wilkinson still made the decisions. And also, being a GM is different than being a head coach. I lean more toward, unless we find out something completely horrible about him that comes out via an investigative report in the coming months or years, everything I have been led to understand about Parsons is that he is a rock-solid, incredibly respected guy. And I think all you need to do is look at the success that Portland had in his 5 seasons there, winning a Shield, winning the title in 2017, bringing in Morgan Weaver, Sam Coffey, Sophia Smith, and that's just the tip of the iceberg of the players that he brought into Portland. This is good business. Now you just need to give him the keys and let him drive the car for multiple seasons here.
All right, let's move on to last team we're going to discuss today, Louisville.
Louisville had not signed any new players until last week, and then they went out and signed 3 college players. And now they are at 26 players on their active roster, if you take out the 2 loanouts. This just might be it for Racing Louisville.
What's your read here?
My read is that they don't want to spend money.
Yep.
They are trying to fill whatever holes they think they can for whatever money they can spend. Ella Hayes is an interesting pickup. Left back / left wing back out of Duke, signed for 2 years plus a mutual option. Going to be 23 next year. Very much could just grab that starting left back job out of camp. Could see that happening. She is very good in attack, makes a lot of progressive runs. 0.24 expected assists per 96 for a fullback is very impressive, and kind of reminds you of another left back who was recently at Louisville.
And who is no longer at Louisville.
Yeah, she short up profiles that way. Completes 6 forward passes per 96. Completes 5 dribbles at a 74% success rate. This is a fullback we're talking about. She's got a lot of attacking nous. As far as the defensive work, I mean, still a 68% defensive duel percentage is really nice. And again, we're reading out numbers from games she played against ranked top 25 sides. And being at Duke, that meant she got a lot of playing time, over 1,000 minutes against those teams. So against the best available competition, she performed very well. And given the state of their left back depth, like, she could just win that job, which is cool. Allie George could be the right back, not as guaranteed to overtake Aaron Wright or Lauren Millay at that spot. Signed for only a year. Virginia Tech did not play many good teams, so we maybe are a little bit less certain about her profile, but I would characterize her as fine as a right back. For a college right back, I don't know how she's going to play as a pro.
Yeah, this feels much more like a 3rd or 4th round pick, where unlike a normal year where a 3rd or 4th round pick might never see the field, she has a guaranteed contract. But it's a year.
Yeah, in 520 minutes against top 25 teams in college, she completed 8 forward passes a game. Very high number, but less than 50% completion rate, which means she was attempting to move the ball ahead a lot and not always getting the job done. 57% defensive duel percentage in those games. Lost the ball 7.5 times per game in the defensive half. It's not the end of the world as a fullback if that's your figure, but it's not special, especially when Hayes only did it 4.5 times. So there's stuff here that could potentially be doable, but it's very high variance and is no sure thing here. Sarah Weber, a number 9 out of Nebraska, 2-year deal, feels to me like she's probably a backup to Bethany Balser. There's potential that you could play her wide and get her into the winger mix, but not amazing as a number 9. Like 0.32 XG per 96 against top 25 sides, which is fewer than 500 minutes being in the Big Ten. So it's a pretty weak conference. It's good, but it's not nailed on. It's not like she was bullying the best available competition. 30% dribble success rate, 0.14 expected assist per 90. Again, like, these numbers are all like okay for college. What does that mean when you're a pro? And with Balser there, with Janine Becky there, with Chinakanu there, like, it kind of doesn't feel like there's a space for her in the 11. So this feels like a bench piece, but they needed some depth there.
This doesn't move the needle at all for me. Ella Hayes is the only one of the 3 that we are looking at that I see the numbers and am curious about. But again, this is where some good scouting, which I don't necessarily have faith that, given all the tumult in Louisville's front office, has been going on, but good scouting could fill the gap here.
The headline piece is Caitlin Milby is their interim GM, like, signed a formal deal and like took a press conference about being the interim GM, which is kind of interesting. They're really making her the face of their offseason. And if we read between the lines, she seems like she's probably going to get the full-time permanent job. We won't know for a while. She's worked for Soccer Holdings LLC in various capacities for 4 years now. She's very much the internal hire that always felt like Louisville was going to do. She didn't have a lot to work with because she didn't have a very big budget, and it was a pretty full roster already, and now it is completely full. Ellie Picky-Yamson and Kirsten Wright, once they get activated from the SEI list, I think Picky-Yamson might even already be activated, they will have 26 players. And so they are going to need to request some players be traded if they want to try and maneuver some things around, which may be coming, because if Wright and Picky-Yamsa are still SEI at the beginning of the season, they'll only have 24 on their roster. They'll need to go pick up a couple of people and then get rid of a couple of people more when Picky-Yamsa and Wright come off. Long way of saying is there's just not a lot of flexibility in this roster 2 months before the season starts right now. And it brings up an interesting point, and I wonder what you think about this, is does guaranteed no trade clauses make it more difficult for GMs with full rosters this early in the offseason to make moves, knowing that in order to get rid of players, they need player sign-off? Do you think it makes it more difficult for them relative to past seasons vis-a-vis roster flexibility?
The short answer is yes.
Yeah.
And the longer answer is yes, absolutely.
Now, this is to say we don't know if there are players behind the scenes who have requested trades and they're trying to work on making those deals happen, and some spots will open up over the next few weeks. And there's no trade deadline anymore because of the no trade clause thing. So you can trade players at any time. So you could trade a player in June, you could trade a player in April, August, wherever. If there is need to create flexibility down the line, it's available to them. But it did make me think, it's like, man, if you are this chock-a-block with roster spots already, how do you try and make your roster better if you have to ask players to be traded? Maybe you don't. Maybe this is just waving the white flag. It's like, this is it, guys. This is what we got.
The one lever that Louisville has to pull is that they undoubtedly have cap space,
which they don't seem interested in spending.
Yeah, it is the lever they seem unwilling to budge on.
Right.
I think if Louisville continues to approach their budget the way they have already, they are in a very difficult position to improve their roster at this point. For teams writ large, yeah, I don't think Gotham had any intention of transferring Yaz Ryan. I don't think San Diego really wanted to move Jaedyn Shaw. Players agitated those moves and forced their GMs into difficult situations. To reverse that situation where you are trying to coax a player to you, that is already quite difficult to get done. The only advantage that a team will have is a player who has their mind made up about coming to you already and that you can offer things. That's the only thing that facilitates trades now. It's not just working with an opposition front office. Yeah. And I think that that's hard. And that said, we have seen clubs like Houston able to coax players away from clubs like Gotham.
Yeah, but you mean Houston had more roster space to play with. But at the same time, like Louisville, like it's not a bad roster. Like Emma Sears, Taylor Flint, Bethany Balser, Marissa DeGrande, Courtney Peterson, Aaron Wright, Janine Becky, Laura Millay, Savannah DeMello, Katie London, Ella Hayes, especially if Ella Hayes hits a high percentile of her potential. That's a team that could potentially compete for the playoffs.
They still have an Abby Ursig-sized question.
At the moment, I think it's probably going to be Wright and Peterson because Peterson's played center back. Wright obviously got a lot of center back minutes. But is that the optimized way to get talent out of your center back depth? And then using Ari Borges and Uchenna Kanu off the bench or switching them into the 11. And Ellie Picky-Yamsa, Kirsten Wright, who are still, coming back from their injuries. They kind of have a pretty good 11 and they kind of have pretty good depth to weather a couple of injuries. But also it just kind of feels like this is a 9th place team again. And that's just gut. Like, I don't know if I have good analysis to back up that feeling, but that's sort of where I'm at with them. They actually have a pretty good team as is. And yet you just think that it's probably 9th place is the ceiling for them.
Yeah, you're not wrong. That's what it feels like to me too. Last year, I think, going in, I felt like the ceiling was higher because we had some uncertainty about what the Bev-Yanez era would look like. And instead, we saw them mildly underperform expectation. I think it's really hard to say, even if Ella Hayes hits, that this team is better day one than it was day one of last year. Do I think that Becky Balser, Uchenna Kanu, Emma Sears, there are goals there? It's still A, I wonder about how that back line holds up. B, is last year a more real version of Katie Lund than we thought we had? And C, what this lack of flexibility and unwillingness to spend will cap out what you can do. The possibility of imagining Louisville going and making a big signing seems more remote than it ever has at this point. So it's a little bleaker than I'd like to report on a team that once showed such promise.
We know more about the 2024 team now than we did in preseason, and it's more or less the same team, barring like a couple of like key attacking additions who still couldn't get them over the line by the end of all of it. So like there's a lower variance on a team that just doesn't move pieces around. So
if Sears takes a jump to the next level, that could be enough to get you over the line into the playoffs. And Emma Sears is very good. If Ella Hayes hits and Emma Sears improves and Janine Becky remains healthy and Bethany Balser is like slightly more bedded in and Taylor Flint reproduces her season last year, there are good pieces that could make you probably not a home playoff game winning team, but a playoff team. Just the mood isn't good enough yet.
We shall see. To close things out, just a couple of smaller moves. Abby Smith got traded to Houston. She's there to back up Jane Campbell, she's still on the SEI list. We don't know when she's going to come back healthy. She's 31 years old. They moved 20K in intra-league transfer funds for her.
When she was last healthy eons ago,
she was great.
She was very good. She was very, very, very good. And being asked to play understudy to Jane Campbell, Houston actually has some really good goalkeeping depth at this point. But yeah, I don't think it moves the needle a ton.
No, not really. Chicago has made 2 signings all offseason. One was just re-signing Sarah Griffith to a 6-month deal. Okay.
Sure.
And then they signed a one-and-done freshman out of Santa Clara, Monica Hayashi, central midfielder, Japanese international. She'll be 20 next year, 3-year deal, so they're really committing to her. Definitely has the opportunity to win a starting place out of camp in Chicago Stars FC's central midfield area. Hard for me to know what she'll be. To bring up Chris Henderson again, he really likes her ball progression ability from central midfield. Scouts really like it generally too. But she played for Santa Clara, so she only ended up getting 1 game against a ranked team, and that was against UNC in the second round of the College Cup. So good numbers, just not up against opposition where you feel any kind of comfort in knowing how they might translate to the professional game.
The one thing you can say about Hayashi is you will get an opportunity to compete for a starting job.
Yeah.
That is not the case for lots of rookies coming into this league out of college. Chicago, for lack of better options in that midfield, she will certainly get more of a look than lots of players coming into this league will get.
Chicago, they've got 24 players under contract at the moment. So a team that really needed to make some moves and haven't done so.
Haven't yet. It is possible at this time last year, Barbara Bando was not a member of the Orlando Pride. And I don't think Rachel Kundananji was a part of Bay. So there's time. But you'd love to see Chicago do more.
Yeah.
Right,
yeah. I mean, they spent a lot of money last year, but they do have money to spend. And I just don't know what Richard Foyt's, where his mind is at with Lauren Donaldson. Like, do they want to be competitive? Do they want to build on their lucky playoff finish last year? Or do they feel like they need to punt and acknowledge 2024 was just getting lucky and there's more long-term work ahead before they get the roster in really good shape? I don't know.
What Chicago's offseason says to me is I'm not sure they're aware how lucky they were last year.
Oh, they signed Maitane, so it's their 3rd signing. I'm sorry. They've signed 3 players this offseason.
We might be talking about a Hayashi Maitane midfield that is just wrecking people. It's possible. But Chicago is not acting like a team that knows they were actually like the 11th or 12th best team in the league last year instead of the 8th best team.
They could have a lot of confidence in Ludmila and Swanson having a full season together and being an attacking force. It could be. They could believe in Jamise Joseph, but it's just a matter of seeing it happen because we haven't seen this particular group make it happen yet.
That's right. Chicago, as it stands right now, is not a playoff team for me next year. And I assume that's probably true for you too.
Yeah, that is true for me. So yeah, that's all the news that's fit to print on Monday, January 20th, 2025. Just gonna let that sit. But thanks for listening. If you are a Patreon subscriber, we will be back on Thursday to do a big European roundup. There were a couple of derbies over the weekend. We'll dive into the Caroline Manchester City signing a little more deeply. There's been rumors around Saki Kumagai potentially moving. We'll think about her potential landing spots. If you are not a member of the Patreon, all you got to do is click the link in the show notes and drop $6 a month or $60 a year and get 4 bonus episodes every single month, as well as access to our Discord server and access to our semi-regular in-game live streams on YouTube. I don't know why you haven't done it yet. It's a pretty good deal. We are going to go to NWSL Media Day at the end of the week, so hopefully be collecting a lot of cool content from that. And otherwise, we will get back to you on main feed on Tuesday next week. If you haven't done so, follow us at XOwnGoals. That's the letter XOwnGoals, all social platforms. Email us if you think we've got an own goal, expectedowngoals@gmail.com. That's the letter expectedowngoals@gmail.com. Do all the things. Rate us 5 stars, review us, follow us, tell your friends about us. You know what to do. Just do it already.
And maybe enjoy some David Lynch content that's coming up right now.
Enjoy some David Lynch content.
Bye. as powerful an in-theater experience as I've ever had was seeing Mulholland Drive for the first time, a movie that I was completely unprepared for. I saw it with Henry Hirsch. That came out in 2001.
Fall of 2001.
So I had just turned 17. I remember Henry was like very concerned about whether we would get carded for Mulholland Drive.
You're the guardian. You're the one leading him in the theater.
Correct. And then realizing that after having taken him to this movie, a movie that you don't have any, and I'd seen Lost Highway and Blue Velvet by then, Mulholland Drive felt like a more complete version of a lot of the ideas that I was prepared for and still knocked my socks off. Me personally, my relationship with that movie is, I even love that the DVD doesn't have chapters and didn't, so you couldn't like skip around in the movie.
That was at Lynch's instruction. He didn't want that.
Which was great, but it was one of those, I think it's that or probably Fire Walk with Me. Lost Highway is incredible, but doesn't come together in the way that those other two films do. What about you?
Well, if you don't want to count any version of Twin Peaks, the television show, which I understand if you wouldn't.
You wrote all those fucking recaps.
In the summer of 2017, Decider, which is a pop culture outlet, had me do weekly, it's weird to even call them recaps because you couldn't summarize the plot of that show and actually make the writing interesting. But basically, every single week, I would watch the episode of Twin Peaks: The Return, which came on at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock Eastern on Sunday night. And then I would have to write in basically the next 90 minutes, at least 1,000 words on what I had just seen. And it would go up and be published at 9 a.m. Eastern the next morning. And for anyone who's seen Twin Peaks: The Return, this is an insane thing to do, especially if you are intending to capture the totalizing effects of every single one of those episodes. So basically what I just did was like, I'm going to find one thing in this episode that I think is interesting, that I can really drill down on and analyze. And that's what I'm going to write about, which was an incredible experience.
Almost certainly the right approach to handling that.
But also, because I did it that way, I realized there were probably things I was going to miss. So then in the week leading up to the next episode, I would watch the previous episode 2 or 3 more times. And then at the end of the series, for the final piece, because Lynch always called it a feature film in 18 parts, I watched all 18 episodes in a row in one sitting and wrote about that experience, which was quite incredible. Basically, I would only take breaks to pee. I already had food and drinks stacked there, ready to go.
Yikes.
It was actually quite a moving experience, and I feel like I pulled things out of the show that would not have been possible if you were watching it week to week. I understand. I don't want to relitigate, is it a movie, is it a TV show?
I don't care.
There are arguments for both experiences. He wrote it and he shot it like a really long movie. He edited it like a TV show, and then it went out as weekly episodes, whatever. But to experience it all in one single go as one whole really helped link things that come into play in the later episodes that are seeded in the early episodes that you kind of don't understand what they mean. And week to week, it's harder to keep track of that stuff. I don't recommend this, but if anybody does have a free 16 hours to watch the whole thing, go for it. For me, Twin Peaks: The Return is number one. In terms of the 10 movies he released in theaters, it's Fire Walk with Me. Cheryl Lee's performance in that movie is the greatest film performance of the 90s. It's one of the greatest film performances of all time. That movie rips you to shreds every time you see it. It's such a strange object. You know, Arkasha Stevenson, the director of The First Omen, she said that she saw Fire Walk with Me without ever having seen or known anything about Twin Peaks. That must have felt insane, but she said it was incredible. And she said the movie wasn't really illegible to her, which is fascinating because how do you understand the prologue or the Red Room stuff? But all of that kind of doesn't matter because the emotional core of the movie is so strong and it's so powerful. That movie really tears me to ribbons.
It's the most Pacific Northwest movie, and I can't explain it.
So true.
Like it's like that and My Own Private Idaho are the two, that's the Pacific Northwest.
After that, I'm a weirdo that likes Inland Empire more than Mulholland Drive.
I get it.
I respect Mulholland Drive. For whatever reason, I've never been able to bond with it in the way that a lot of people have. What argument against Mulholland Drive could I possibly offer? I'm aware of that. I know this is a me thing. It's not the movie thing.
No. I also think that, he wins the Palme d'Or for Wild at Heart.
Yeah, not one of my faves.
Yeah, definitely. I think Mulholland Drive is probably, for me, the movie where I realized I wanted to know absolutely nothing about a movie before going and seeing it, which is sort of backwards because you could have known everything about Mulholland Drive and still been blown away by it. But it was such a visceral experience, and it taught me to just like let movies happen to you.
Yeah.
Because you have no choice with Mulholland Drive. You are just like in it and feeling emotions. It's like the great Los Angeles movie.
I mean, it has some of the best stuff he ever shot. Obviously, the Club Silencio sequence is jaw-dropping.
Totally. It feels like he'd been working on that sequence and done versions of it in several movies. But yeah, I get it. I don't think there's a right answer to...
Mulholland Drive was the number 8 movie on Sight and Sound's most recent poll of greatest movies ever made. Like, it's garnered a reputation now of like, is it the best movie of the century? Is it one of the best American movies of the last 30 years? Like, it sort of has that place, and also the way in which it revived his career, because Lost Highway was not a success, and Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me at the time was not a success. And obviously season 2 of Twin Peaks was so controversial that Mulholland Drive seemed to be this interesting reset button. I think what I've always loved about him is that, because also Blue Velvet isn't one of my favorites of his. It's a movie I like, and I obviously, again, the sequence when Kyle MacLachlan's in the closet and everything that happens before and after that, there's a reason that movie made such a splash in 1986. But I think what is so interesting to me about him is that most directors get less avant-garde as they get older, particularly in the way in which David Lynch got much more avant-garde with every passing film. You carve out the space for Eraserhead, it being sort of what it is. But like you start from The Elephant Man forward through Inland Empire. This is a man who just like kind of kept tunneling further and further and further into his own predilections until he got to a point where he really didn't, if any semblance of narrative logic was available to you, to instantly grab onto. You can see the steps, especially when his movies start becoming interested in doppelgangers and split identities and the Mobius strip of narrative logic. Fire Walk with Me kind of has a very, very soft version of that. Lost Highway, every character understands that these two people are different people. You know, in the prison sequence when you discover Balthazar Getty in the prison cell, that's how it's read. It's like, where is Bill Pullman? We don't get it. And then you go to Mulholland Drive, it's just a very clean and neat bifurcation between what the Betty Rita half is and then what the Diane to Camilla. Is that Laura Herring's character?
I think that's right.
Yeah, there's that clean line after they go to Club Silencio and go back to the apartment. All of a sudden the movie shifts. And we all know the production history and like why that takes effect. Inland Empire doesn't give a fuck about any of that. It gives you these little drizzles in the first 20 minutes and then it just sends you down. At one point, rabbits do show up. Rabbit hole of identity. You never have a grasp on who's quote unquote real and who's quote unquote not real. Is everybody real? Is Nikki becoming Sue? Is Sue a hallucination? There's nothing that you can hold on to. And then with Twin Peaks: The Return, he has somehow managed to keep that philosophy in a much more narrative structure of a TV show, especially when you get to the final episode.
Sure.
Which is so fucking haunting and so fucking devastating. I think that there are very few filmmakers who can say they became less interested in narrative logic, like aggressively less interested in narrative logic, the more work that they made, especially for someone who interfaced with the mainstream as much as he did. Obviously, he's never going to be as close to a mainstream narrative filmmaker the way that Spielberg, Scorsese, or Demme were, but he still worked with movie stars. He was still connected to Hollywood. He was obviously a brand unto himself. It's very rare that a director's second movie is something like The Elephant Man, and then their final theatrically released feature is something like Inland Empire. That's a really unique course for a filmmaker's career to take.
I love his fish quote, and I think about it all the time.
Oh, from Catching the Big Fish, the book he wrote?
I'll share it here. Ideas are like fish. If you want to catch little fish, you can stay in shallow water. But if you want to catch the big fish, you've got to go deeper. Down deep, the fish are more powerful and more pure. They are huge and abstract, and they are very beautiful. And I think his career is the arc of going from working with simpler ideas to working with profoundly difficult ideas that may not make sense to other people and persevering with those ideas, then letting other people experience the byproduct of your own imagination. So I view him as someone who, if you choose to incorporate into your own life, has a great chance of profoundly changing the way you look at the world in a way that Spielberg and maybe no one else who immediately jumps to mind have the capacity to do. I think about his willingness to continue refining a series of thoughts that haunted him as the arc of his career.
Edward Said elucidated the concept of late style many decades ago, and a lot of what Said says is that late style involves older artists stripping away and essentializing and refining the things that are really important to them. And I guess why I didn't quite phrase it like that for Lynch is because I think there are a lot of filmmakers. I think Scorsese is very much in a late style mode. I think Spielberg, to a certain extent, is doing that as well. But if you are the type of person who thinks that narrative causality in fictional work is somehow a compromise in and of itself, then Scorsese and Spielberg, to some extent, are still compromising, even though they are still embodying that essentializing idea. Whereas Lynch just threw all of that away and threw more and more of it away as his career went on. How many filmmakers who got their start after 1967 can you say their names became an adjective?
That is, of course, totally fair.
And you read all these filmmakers' eulogies to him over the last few days. I was just mentioning Arkasha Stevenson. I don't think The First Omen has that same tone that it has if Stevenson didn't feel like Lynch was such a central part of her filmmaking life. I don't think that I Saw the TV Glow is what it is without Jane Schoenbrunn loving David Lynch movies. Severance just came back on Apple TV+. Does Severance exist in the way that it does? Softer, like much more mainstream versions, like do Lost or The Leftovers happen in the way that they do without Damon Lindelof being such a Twin Peaks obsessive? The reactions to his death that I have seen are of such a volume and of such a power, like a personal emotional power, that I don't know if I've seen from a great master filmmaker who has died over the last decade plus. I mean, with all respect and love to Jonathan Demme, a filmmaker I like a lot, and I know who was beloved by those really connected to him, there was something almost in terms of like a Lynchian emotional response people had to Lynch's death. And I think also something that I've become aware of that I wouldn't have been aware of when I was younger is how central he is to a lot of queer women's and trans women's, especially filmmakers, their experience of what great filmmaking can be. Vera Drew, who directed The People's Joker, wrote this incredible post thread on Blue Sky talking about how David Lynch saved her life because she found transcendental meditation and she found trans readings in his work that really connected herself to him. And I think Jane Schoenbrunn probably would say the same thing. Willow McClay and Caden Mark Gardner, who wrote this incredible book called Corpses, Fools, and Monsters about the history of transness and the trans image in the history of cinema, cite Lynch as one of the most important filmmakers in their lives. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized the spread and the scale of his influence is actually kind of incalculable. And that, I think, is incredibly rare for a filmmaker. And again, there's only a handful of filmmakers in cinema history whose last names became adjectives. And Lynch is the only one that I can think of over the last half century who fits that. He's a really special guy. I mean, I called him a sincere postmodernist or a mainstream avant-gardist, which are dialectics, and yet somehow he fills them effortlessly in a level of effortlessness that nobody who has ever tried to incorporate his style or even just straight up imitate him could ever repeat to the same level. I mean, he is sui generis. He is one of one.
As far as effect on other artists go, yeah, I think David Lynch is outsized. I accept the final season of Twin Peaks as one of the most staggering human achievements of directing. It is unbelievable to direct, 18 hours, 17, 18 hours of a movie?
If you cut out the credits, it's like 16 hours, 15 hours, something like that. CinemaScope, which is sadly a defunct, great quarterly film magazine, which definitely skewed toward the highbrow and the avant-garde. But as a film magazine, they said Twin Peaks: The Return was the best movie of the decade.
Yeah.
There is no TV show like it. There will never be another TV show like it.
Yeah.
He was like on the cover of Rolling Stone and Time magazine.
He became an idiosyncratic pop culture figure.
Which is just so bizarre. I think Pauline Kael called him the world's first populist surrealist. It's insane. If you haven't already, please read Kyle MacLachlan's and Naomi Watts' eulogies to him. You don't see actors write about their directors quite in the way that they wrote about him. Perhaps even the most important thing to say about how someone feels about Lynch's passing is Laura Dern hasn't said anything about it.
Yeah,
because I think it's just too much.
Which I think is also a very David Lynch approach.
I think she'll say something eventually, but I don't think she's probably in any place to do it.
The Criterion Channel has so much of what he made up currently right now.
If you can get a 7-day free trial if you don't want to spend the money, but it's also the best $100 a year you'll ever spend.
Not all of that has to be for you, but it is, even in small doses, art people should at least expose themselves to, even if they want to turn it off. The best note to leave this on is, I always return to the other quote, the David Foster Wallace quote, from the article he wrote about Lost Highway. Whatever you may think about David Foster Wallace, the essay that he wrote on Lost Highway, as my experience of working in film production is concerned, is the best thing that has ever been written about the chaos of being on a set. He writes this huge description of Lynchian, and I think it's great. And then he comes back a couple hundred words later and just says, Quentin Tarantino is interested in watching somebody's ear get cut off. David Lynch is interested in the ear. We are impoverished for having lost an artist who is interested in the ear because so few of them are. We all recognize it is important to be interested in the ear.
Llorando.